She wasn't just a bride. She was a woman who could read numbers like weapons. In a town ruled by lies, greed, and blood, Clara Vance chose not to run. She chose to fight, not with bullets, but with truth. But when truth becomes dangerous, will it be enough to survive? The story teaches us intelligence and courage can be just as powerful as any weapon. Welcome to a place where we tell Western stories of cowboys, love, family, sacrifice, and the strength of the human heart. Like, comment, share, and subscribe if you believe in stories of strength and resilience. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The dust of Red Creek had a way of settling into everything, but Clara Vance refused to let it settle into her spirit. She stood on the wooden platform of the train depot, a striking anomaly in a heavy, ivory-colored wedding dress she had sewn herself. The hem was already coated in a thick layer of terracotta dirt. She had traveled 2,000 miles from the suffocating debts of her past in Cincinnati, clutching a promise in the form of letters from a man named Arthur Pendleton. But Arthur wasn't here to meet her. Instead, Gideon Croft was. The town mayor and land officials stood before her, smelling of expensive bay rum and cheap intentions. His boots were polished to a mirror shine that mocked the rough-hewn boards beneath them. "I assure you, Miss Vance, it was a sudden and tragic bout of the fever," Croft said, his voice slick with practiced sympathy. He thrust a piece of paper toward her. "Arthur passed 3 days ago. As he died intestate and without kin, the county must unfortunately reclaim the Pendleton acreage." Clara didn't take the paper. She stared at it, then up at Croft's face. There was a gleam in his eye, a predatory calculation that Clara recognized all too well. It was the same look her ex-husband wore right before he gambled away her inheritance. "So," Croft continued, reaching into his tailored waistcoat to produce a train ticket, "the eastbound arrives in an hour. The county is generous enough to cover your return fare. You have no business here now, little lady." Clara took the ticket. She looked at the heavy black lettering pointing her back to a life of ruin. Her hands didn't shake. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow motion, she tore the ticket directly down the center. Then she tore it again. She let the pieces flutter to the dusty planks. "I didn't ride a train for 2 weeks just to be handed condolences and a ticket to nowhere, Mr. Croft," Clara said, her voice ringing like struck iron. "I came here to be a wife." Croft's polite smile vanished. "You are a spinster with no property and no ties to Red Creek. You will get on that train or the sheriff will escort you onto it." "She ain't getting on any train, Croft." The voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards. Clara turned. The man standing at the edge of the platform was built like a mountain storm. He had a 100-pound sack of grain slung effortlessly over one broad shoulder. A weathered Stetson was pulled low, but it couldn't hide the jagged, pale scar that slashed across his left cheekbone, narrowly missing a pair of eyes as sharp and cold as winter ice. He wore a heavy canvas duster pushed back on the right side, revealing the worn wooden grip of a Colt .45 tied low to his thigh. Silas Thorne hadn't come to town looking for a fight. He'd come for winter wheat, but he'd been watching the exchange from the feed store across the street. He knew Gideon Croft's brand of poison, and he knew Arthur Pendleton hadn't died of any damn fever. Silas had seen the fire in the woman's eyes when she ripped up the ticket, and before his rational mind could stop him, his boots were carrying him across the street. Croft sneered. "This is county business, Thorne. Go back to your dirt farm." Silas dropped the sack of grain. It hit the platform with a heavy final thud. He stepped up, placing himself squarely between the corrupt mayor and the woman in the wedding dress. He smelled of horse, leather, and pine, a sharp, clean scent that instantly grounded Clara's racing heart. "It's my business," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. He didn't look at Clara, keeping his eyes locked on Croft. "Arthur owed me. And seeing as he ain't around to pay his debts, I'm collecting." "Collecting what?" Croft snapped. Silas finally turned his head, his cold eyes sweeping over Clara. He took in her defiant chin, the ink stains permanently etched into the side of her right index finger, and the sheer, desperate courage radiating from her. "Her," Silas said. Clara gasped. Croft barked a harsh laugh. "You can't just claim a woman, Thorne. She came here to marry Pendleton." "And Pendleton's dead," Silas countered, stepping closer to Croft until the mayor was forced to lean back. "The lady came to Red Creek to get married. I'm a bachelor in need of a wife to help run the Broken Spur. Seems like a fair trade." He turned fully to Clara, offering a hand roughly the size of a dinner plate, calloused and scarred. "If you want to stay in this town, ma'am, we need to walk over to the judge's office right now. I'm Silas Thorne." Clara looked at his hand, then at the livid face of Gideon Croft. She didn't know this towering, scarred stranger, but she knew a lifeline when she saw one. She placed her small, ink-stained hand into his massive one. "I'm Clara Vance. Lead the way, Mr. Thorne." 20 minutes later, the ink was drying on a marriage certificate, and Clara was officially a wife. Just not to the man she expected. The wagon ride to the Broken Spur was a master class in suffocating silence. The late afternoon sun painted the New Mexico territory in shades of bruised purple and fiery gold. Silas drove the team with an easy, unconscious grace, his large hands managing the heavy leather reins as if they were silk threads. Clara sat stiffly beside him, her ridiculous wedding dress taking up too much space on the bench. Every time the wagon hit a rut, her shoulder brushed against his solid arm, sending a jolt of unwanted electricity straight to her toes. She covertly studied her new husband. Up close, the scars were more prominent, not just on his face, but a jagged line peeking out from the collar of his shirt. He carried an air of violence about him, tightly leashed, but ever present. Yet, when he clicked his tongue to soothe the draft horses, the sound was surprisingly gentle. Silas, for his part, was acutely aware of the woman beside him. He hadn't missed the way she catalogued his weapons. The rifle booted beside his leg, the revolver on his hip, the knife handle visible in his boot. Most women would have cowered. Clara just observed, filing the information away. He had noticed her hands when she signed the marriage register. They weren't the soft, useless hands of an Eastern socialite. They were capable. And that ink stain on her finger told him she knew her way around a ledger. "It ain't a mansion," Silas said abruptly, the deep timbre of his voice startling her as the ranch came into view. The Broken Spur sat nestled in a shallow valley. There was a sturdy barn, a large corral, and a cabin built of thick, weathered logs. It was isolated, rugged, and completely utterly silent. "I didn't come west looking for a mansion," Clara replied evenly. "I came looking for a place to stand." Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. Before Clara could navigate her heavy skirts, his hands were at her waist, lifting her down to the dirt, as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. For a second, her hands rested on his broad shoulders. The heat radiating from him was a tangible thing. He stepped back immediately, clearing his throat. "I'll see to the horses. Go on inside, door's open." Clara pushed open the heavy wooden door. The cabin was exactly what she expected of a solitary, hardened man. One large room, a cast-iron stove, a sturdy table, and against the far wall a single narrow bed covered in a heavy wool blanket. One bed. She swallowed hard, setting her small carpetbag on the table. The place was clean, ruthlessly so, but it lacked any touch of warmth. On the far end of the long wooden table sat a stack of leather-bound ledgers, a jar of ink, and a scattering of receipts weighed down by a rusted horseshoe. When Silas came in an hour later, smelling of fresh hay and cool night air, he found Clara out of her wedding dress, wearing a simple, practical gray skirt and a white blouse, her hair braided tightly down her back. She had a pot of coffee boiling on the stove. He paused in the doorway, staring at the domesticity of the scene. It hit him harder than a physical blow. "Coffee's ready," she said, not looking at him. They drank in silence. As the fire died down, the reality of the single bed loomed in the small cabin. Clara stiffened, preparing herself for the inevitable negotiation of their hasty bargain. Silas set his tin cup down, grabbed a spare blanket from a chest, and turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Clara asked, surprised. "The porch," Silas said without turning around. "I prefer the open air anyway." "The bed is yours, Mrs. Thorne." Before she could argue, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Clara lay in the dark for a long time, the heavy wool blanket pulled to her chin. Outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing mixed with the wind howling off the mesa. Her mind, trained to find order in chaos, refused to shut down. The adrenaline of the day was wearing off, leaving a restless, gnawing anxiety in its wake. Unable to sleep, she lit a single kerosene lantern, turning the wick low. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and padded over to the heavy wooden table. She traced her fingers over the leather ledgers Silas had left out. It was none of her business. But Arthur had died suddenly. Croft had been entirely too eager to claim the land, and her new husband slept with a gun in his hand. Clara opened the top ledger. The handwriting was a rough, impatient scrawl. Silas Thorne was a man of action, not a man of numbers. Clara's eyes, trained by years of managing her father's shipping accounts and unraveling her ex-husband's debts, immediately caught the inconsistencies. She pulled a chair out quietly and sat down. She opened the ink jar, found a pen, and pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her. She cross-referenced a stack of county tax receipts with the entries in Silas's book. Her breath hitched in the quiet cabin. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. The county assessment values entered by Gideon Croft's office were systematically inflated, while the recorded payments were artificially lowered, creating a compounding fictitious debt on the broken spur. Croft wasn't just stealing Arthur's land. He was actively bleeding Silas dry to steal his, too. Clara looked toward the bolted wooden door, thinking of the scarred, dangerous man sleeping on the cold planks outside to protect her honor. She dipped her pen into the ink. Gideon Croft had made a terrible mistake. He had let a woman who knew how to read the hidden stories in numbers survive the day. Dawn broke over the broken spur, not with a gentle lightening of the sky, but with a harsh, brilliant slash of gold that seemed to ignite the rugged peaks of the surrounding mesas. Clara Vance, now Clara Thorne, a fact that still sent a strange, cold thrill down her spine, awoke to the rhythmic, percussive sound of an axe biting into hard wood. She lay still for a moment, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and the sharp, clean scent of the man who had slept outside on the porch to protect her reputation. The cabin was freezing, the fire in the cast-iron stove having died down to mere embers sometime in the deepest part of the night. Her breath plumed white in the frigid air. Clara pushed herself up, her muscles aching from the jarring wagon ride and the sheer, exhausting terror of the previous day. She dressed quickly in the dim light, pulling her thickest gray woolen skirt and a high-collared white cotton blouse over her corset, shivering as she buttoned it up to her throat. She braided her dark hair with quick, practiced movements, pinning it securely at the nape of her neck. She was not a woman who allowed herself to look disheveled. Order was her armor. And right now she needed all the armor she could get, because the stack of papers she had left neatly arranged on the long wooden table was going to start a fire much hotter than the one she was currently trying to coax back to life in the stove. She had coffee boiling and a simple pan of salted pork and flatbread warming by the time the heavy wooden door creaked open. Silas ducked his head to clear the frame, carrying an armful of split pine. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her standing by the stove. He looked rougher in the morning light. The jagged scar across his cheekbone stood out starkly against his sun-darkened skin. He wore no coat, just a faded blue work shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with thick muscle and a dusting of dark hair. He looked like a man built entirely of rawhide, danger, and quiet violence. "Morning," he grunted, his voice a gravelly scrape that indicated he hadn't used it much since the day before. He moved to the wood box, depositing the logs with a heavy clatter. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, keeping her voice perfectly level as she poured 2 tin cups of pitch-black coffee. "I trust the porch was, accommodating?" Silas shot her a look from beneath the brim of his hat, which he hadn't yet removed. "I've slept on worse. Ground's hard, but it doesn't complain." He took the cup she offered, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The heat of his skin was startling against the morning chill. He pulled his hand back quickly, taking a sip of the scalding brew without flinching. "Coffee's good. Strong." "It's how my father took it," Clara said. She walked over to the table and sat down, placing her hands flat on the smooth wood, right next to the open ledger. She didn't touch her own coffee. "Mr. Thorne, we need to talk." Silas sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He pulled off his hat, tossing it onto a nearby peg, and ran a hand through his thick, dark hair. "If it's about the arrangement, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his tongue was unexpectedly intimate. "I told you you're safe here. I ain't expecting wifely duties. The marriage just keeps Croft from putting you on a train." "It is not about the arrangement," Clara interrupted gently but firmly. "It is about this." She tapped her index finger against the open page of the ledger. Silas's posture instantly changed. The relaxed, tired rancher vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of a gunfighter. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the ink-stained pages as if they were a rattlesnake coiled on his dining table. "I told you I ain't much for books," he said, his voice dropping a dangerous octave. "I keep track of what I owe and what I earn, roughly." "Roughly is what is going to get you evicted from your own land, Silas," Clara said, using his first name as a strategic counterstrike. She spun the ledger around so it faced him, pointing to a column of figures she had transcribed in the middle of the night. "Sit down, please." He hesitated, his jaw working, before pulling out the chair opposite hers and lowering his massive frame into it. The table seemed to shrink with his presence. "Look at these numbers," Clara instructed, her tone shifting into the crisp, authoritative cadence she used to use when managing the shipping manifests back in Cincinnati. "Here, in April of last year, you recorded paying $60 in county property taxes. You have the receipt right here, stamped by Gideon Croft's office." She pushed a faded slip of paper toward him. "I paid it," Silas said defensively. "Handed the silver to Croft himself." "I believe you," Clara said. "But look at the ledger entry you made 2 months later, copying from the quarterly assessment notice Croft sent you. The recorded payment on your account is only $40. $20 vanished." Silas frowned, leaning closer. "A clerical error. The clerk in that office is an idiot." "Once is an error," Clara said, her voice dropping into a relentless rhythm. "Twice is a coincidence. 8 times over 3 years is a systematic strategy of financial bleed. Every single tax payment you have made since you bought this land has been under-recorded by 10, 20, or 30%. Simultaneously, the assessed value of your eastern pasture, the one bordering Arthur Pendleton's property, has been artificially inflated. You are compounding a fictitious debt, Mr. Thorne. According to Croft's books, which he is building against you, you owe the county over $400 in back taxes." Silas stared at the numbers. The silence in the cabin stretched, tight as a bowstring. Slowly he leaned back in his chair. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. 400, he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "If I owe 400 to the county—" "He can foreclose," Clara finished for him. "He can seize the broken spur legally, without firing a single shot. He was doing it to you, and I guarantee you he was doing it to Arthur Pendleton. Only Arthur figured it out." Silas closed his eyes. The scar on his face seemed to pull tight. When he opened them, the cold fury in his gaze made Clara's breath hitch. But the anger wasn't directed at her. It was directed inward. "I should have known," he rasped, his voice vibrating with a deep, ugly self-loathing. "I should have looked closer, but I hate the damn things. I can't look at a ledger without—" He stopped, swallowing hard. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back, and paced to the window, staring out at the barren yard. "Without what, Silas?" Clara asked softly, turning in her chair to watch his broad back. He was quiet for a long time. The wind rattled the window pane. Finally, he spoke, his voice stripped of its usual gruff armor, leaving something raw and bleeding in its wake. "Before I came to Red Creek, I worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency," Silas said to the glass. "I was a bounty hunter, a tracker. I brought in men who didn't want to be brought in. I was good at it because I didn't ask questions. I just followed the paper, the warrants, the ledgers." He turned back to face her, leaning against the window frame. "5 years ago, I tracked a man named Elias Vance to a mining camp in Colorado. The company ledgers said he embezzled $10,000. The warrant was signed by a judge. I hunted him down. He swore he was innocent, swore the company bosses had cooked the books to cover their own theft, and pinned it on him because he was a nobody. I didn't listen. I told him paper doesn't lie." Clara sat perfectly still. She knew where this was going, and her heart ached for the towering, broken man across the room. "He tried to run," Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which somehow made it worse. "I shot him in the leg, dragged him back to Denver. They hung him 3 weeks later." Silas looked down at his hands. "A year after that, the mining company collapsed. Federal investigators came in. They found the real books hidden in a safe. Elias Vance had been telling the truth. The bosses had forged the ledgers to frame him. I hunted an innocent man, Clara. I shot an innocent man, and I watched him hang, all because I trusted what was written on a piece of paper." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Since that day, I haven't trusted a single document, ledger, or piece of paper with a government stamp on it. A gun tells the truth. You look a man in the eye, and you know where you stand. But paper is just a place where cowards hide their lies. So I stopped looking at it. I buried myself in this ranch, worked the dirt, and ignored the books." Clara absorbed the weight of his confession. She understood now. His neglect wasn't laziness. It was trauma. It was a profound, paralyzing fear of the very tools she used to make sense of the world. She stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked across the room. She stopped a foot away from him. He was a foot taller than her, a mountain of muscle and guilt, but she didn't flinch. "You are right," Clara said quietly, looking directly into his ice-blue eyes. "Paper is where cowards hide their lies, but it is also where they leave their tracks." Silas let out a ragged breath. "I can't fight him on paper, Clara. I don't know how. If Croft says I owe it, he'll bring the sheriff, and I'll have to shoot my way out of my own home." "No, you won't," Clara said fiercely. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her small, ink-stained hand flat against the center of his broad chest, right over his heart. She felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of it beneath his shirt. Silas froze, his eyes widening slightly at her touch. "My ex-husband was a coward who hid behind paper too," Clara told him, her voice unwavering. "He forged my signature, gambled away my father's business, and left me with debts that took me 2 years of scrubbing floors to pay off. I know how men like Croft operate. They rely on the fact that honest men like you won't look closely at the math." She pressed her hand a little firmer against his chest. "You don't have to look at the ledgers, Silas. You don't have to fight the paper war. That is my territory. You brought me to this ranch. You gave me your name to protect me from him. Now let me be your shield here. Let me hunt him on paper." Silas stared down at the fierce, beautiful woman standing before him. He felt the heat of her hand seeping through his shirt, melting a block of ice that had sat in his chest for 5 long years. He had brought home a desperate spinster to spite a corrupt mayor. He hadn't realized he was bringing home a warrior. Slowly his large hand came up, covering hers where it rested against his chest. His thumb brushed over the ink stain on her knuckle. "All right, Mrs. Thorne," he whispered, the gravel in his voice entirely different now. "We do it your way. Where do we start?" "We go into town," Clara said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "And we smile. We let Gideon Croft think he has already won." The ride into Red Creek felt entirely different than the ride out. Yesterday, Clara had been a terrified, displaced woman sitting beside a menacing stranger. Today, she was a wife on a mission, sitting beside a partner. If we're going to convince Croft and the rest of this town that this wasn't just a desperate ploy to keep Arthur's land out of his hands, we need to act like newlyweds, Clara had instructed as Silas hitched the team. Silas had simply grunted, his jaw tight. Acting was not in his repertoire. But as the wagon rattled down the dusty main street of Red Creek, Clara saw exactly how deeply Silas understood survival. Without a word, he shifted his weight on the bench, closing the physical distance between them. He draped his right arm casually along the back of the wooden seat, his large hand resting just behind Clara's shoulder. The heat of him was a solid, reassuring presence against the chill wind. Red Creek was a town built on hard dirt and harder secrets. It consisted of a single wide thoroughfare flanked by false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a telegraph office, a livery, the imposing brick facade of the county land and tax office, and the sprawling general mercantile. As they drove slowly down the street, Clara could feel the eyes. Faces peeked out from beneath the brims of hats on the boardwalk. Curtains twitched in the boarding house windows. "Don't stare back," Silas murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. The proximity sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Just smile. Look at the storefronts. Look at me." Clara turned her head, meeting his gaze. His eyes were scanning the street with predatory efficiency, but he arranged his features into something resembling rugged contentment. It was a good mask. She forced a soft smile to her lips, playing the part of the blushing, relieved bride who had miraculously found a protector. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile. He wrapped the reins around the brake, jumped down, and then turned to Clara. He didn't just offer his hand. He reached up and spanned her waist with both of his large hands. Clara gasped softly as he lifted her effortlessly from the seat, letting her slide down the length of his body before her boots touched the dusty boardwalk. For a fleeting second, they were pressed together, chest to chest. She could smell leather, pine, and the faint metallic scent of gun oil. Her hands automatically rested on his forearms, feeling the hard, coiled muscle beneath his sleeves. "Careful, darling," Silas said, his voice loud enough to carry to the two men leaning against the saloon posts across the street. The endearment felt rough on his tongue, but it hit Clara's ears like a physical caress. "Thank you, Silas," she breathed, genuinely flushed. They stepped into the dimly lit cavern of the general mercantile. It smelled wonderfully of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, peppermint sticks, and dry wool. The store was empty of customers, save for the proprietor standing behind the long wooden counter. Martha Higgins was a woman carved from the same hard landscape as the town itself. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had run the store since her husband took a stray bullet 10 years ago, and she commanded respect through sheer, unapologetic competence. "Silas Thorne," Martha said, her voice dry as dust. She wiped her hands on a canvas apron and turned her piercing gaze on Clara. "Heard you came into town yesterday for winter wheat and rode out with a bride. Folks are talking." "Let them talk, Martha," Silas said, stepping up to the counter. He kept Clara tucked close to his side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "This is Clara, my wife." "Mrs. Thorne," Martha nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to Clara's dress, taking in the practical wool and the lack of frills. She seemed to approve. "I'm sorry about Arthur. He was a good man, too quiet for his own good, but a good man." "Thank you," Clara said softly. "It was a terrible shock." "Fever takes a man quick out here," Martha said. but there was a strange, flat quality to her tone. She didn't believe it any more than they did. "We need supplies," Silas said, pulling a list from his pocket. "Flour, sugar, salt, a new tin of coffee, and Clara needs whatever she requires to set up the house proper." "Feel free to look around, Mrs. Thorne," Martha said, gesturing to the back aisles. "Silas and I will get the heavy sacks loaded." Clara took the cue. She wandered toward the back of the store, pretending to examine bolts of calico and tins of baking powder. She kept her ears strained. Silas and Martha spoke in low murmurs near the front, mostly about the price of goods, but the tension in the room was palpable. Red Creek was a town holding its breath. After 10 minutes, Clara returned to the counter carrying a small basket of needles, thread, and a few jars of preserves. Martha was writing up the total on a brown paper slip. "That'll be $8.40, Martha said. Silas reached into his pocket, producing a leather coin purse. As he counted out the silver, Martha leaned across the counter to bag Clara's items. With a swift, practiced motion, the older woman slid the brown paper receipt toward Clara. Tucked perfectly beneath the receipt was a small, torn scrap of ledger paper. Clara didn't blink. She smoothly picked up the receipt, trapping the scrap beneath it, and slid it into her skirt pocket in one seamless motion. She met Martha's eyes. The older woman gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Pleasure doing business with you, Silas," Martha said loudly. "You take care of this girl." "I intend to," Silas said. He picked up the heavy sack of flour, his other hand finding its place at Clara's back once more. They walked back out into the blinding sunlight. Silas loaded the supplies into the wagon. "What did she give you?" he asked quietly, not looking at her, pretending to check the harness. Clara reached into her pocket, unfolding the scrap of paper within the concealment of her skirt folds. She glanced down. Written in a hasty, sharp pencil scrawl were 4 words. Arthur knew too much. Clara's blood ran cold. It was the confirmation they needed and the warning they feared. It wasn't just a paper war anymore. "Confirmation," Clara whispered back. She looked down the street toward the imposing brick building. "Take me to the land office, Silas. I need to see Gideon Croft." Silas stopped adjusting the harness. He turned to look at her, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Clara, if Croft killed Arthur over whatever he found, walking into his office is putting your head in the lion's mouth." "I am not going to accuse him of murder," Clara said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I am going to ask him a question about property boundaries. I need to see how he reacts when a woman asks to see the public records. He thinks I'm a grieving, helpless spinster. I want to use his arrogance against him." Silas studied her face. He saw no hesitation, only a terrifying, brilliant resolve. He let out a breath, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his Colt. "All right," he said, "but I do the talking if things get heated, and you stay behind me." The county land and tax office was a shrine to Gideon Croft's ego. It smelled of expensive cigars, floor wax, and power. Croft was seated behind a massive oak desk, smoking, while a nervous-looking young clerk shuffled papers in the corner. Croft looked up as the door chimed. His polite, oily smile slid perfectly into place, though his eyes hardened when he saw Silas. "Mr. Thorne, and the new Mrs. Thorne," Croft said, standing up smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I assumed you would be busy settling into domestic bliss." "We are." Clara stepped forward before Silas could speak. She didn't hide behind her husband. She stood tall, her posture impeccable. "However, as Silas's new wife, I am taking over the management of the household accounts, including the property ledgers." Croft's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Is that so? How progressive." "I like things organized, Mr. Croft," Clara said pleasantly. "In reviewing the documents, I noticed some confusion regarding the eastern boundary of the broken spur, the line adjoining the late Mr. Pendleton's property. Since the county has reclaimed Arthur's land, I want to ensure our fences are properly placed before winter. The boundaries are clearly marked on the deed, Mrs. Thorne, Croft said dismissively, sitting back down. There is no confusion. Actually, there is, Clara countered, her voice taking on the crisp edge of a seasoned accountant. The acreage recorded on our tax assessments doesn't match the original plat survey Silas has from 5 years ago. I would like to request the public survey records for the eastern quadrant, as well as the tax assessment roll for the past 3 years, just to clear up my own confusion, of course. The silence in the room was sudden and absolute. The young clerk in the corner stopped shuffling papers and stared at Clara as if she had just grown a second head. Silas stood perfectly still, a mountain of silent menace behind her. He suddenly realized what Clara was doing. She wasn't just asking for papers. She was firing a warning shot across Croft's bow. She was letting him know that the books were being watched by someone who actually knew how to read them. Croft's face lost its oily charm. The skin around his eyes tightened. He looked at Clara not as a helpless woman, but as a threat. "Those documents are archived, Mrs. Thorne," Croft said, his voice dropping the polite pretense. "It takes weeks to pull them, and frankly, the county does not open its books to appease the idle curiosity of a rancher's wife." "It is not idle curiosity, Mr. Croft," Clara said, taking a step closer to the desk. She placed both hands firmly on the polished oak, leaning over him. "It is a formal request under Section 14 of the Territorial Property Code, which mandates that public tax rolls and survey plats be made available to any adjacent landowner within 3 business days of a verbal request." She smiled, a cold, sharp expression that mirrored Silas's own. "I will be back on Friday. I expect them to be ready." She stood up straight, turned gracefully, and walked toward the door. "Coming, Silas?" Silas looked down at Gideon Croft, whose face was slowly turning a mottled, furious shade of red. Silas felt a slow, dark grin spread across his scarred face. He tipped his hat to the mayor. "Have a good day, Croft," Silas rumbled. He followed his wife out into the sunlight. As the door clicked shut behind them, Silas looked at the petite, fiercely intelligent woman walking beside him. He had thought he was bringing home a shield to protect his property. He realized now, with a profound mix of awe and terror, that he had brought a gunfighter to a paper war. And she never missed her mark. The air inside the cabin of the Broken Spur felt as heavy and charged as a thunderhead. By nightfall, the weather had rolled in off the high mesas, bringing with it a violent, bruising darkness. The wind howled down the chimney, sending puffs of wood smoke into the room, while rain lashed against the thick log walls with the force of thrown gravel. Silas had not spoken more than 10 words since they left Red Creek. The drive back had been conducted at a punishing pace. As soon as the horses were secured in the barn, Silas had stalked into the cabin, pulled a Winchester rifle from its scabbard above the door, and begun cleaning it with a terrifying, methodical precision. The rhythmic snick-clack of the lever action was the only sound competing with the storm. Clara sat at the long wooden table, a kerosene lantern pushed to the far edge to illuminate her work. She was trying to focus on the numbers, transcribing the tax discrepancies onto a clean sheet of paper to build an undeniable case against Gideon Croft. But her eyes kept darting to the massive, brooding man in the corner. He was a coiled spring. The confrontation in the land office had shifted something fundamental in the air between them. Clara had thrown down a gauntlet, using the law as her weapon. But out here in the isolated dark of the territory, the law was a fragile shield against desperate men. "You should sleep," Silas said abruptly, not looking up from the oiled rag in his hands. He snapped the cylinder of his Colt .45 shut with a sharp flick of his wrist. "It's past midnight." "I am not tired," Clara lied, her shoulders aching with tension. She looked at the small, burlap-wrapped bundle resting at the edge of the table. Martha Higgins had slipped it into the bottom of the flour sack at the mercantile. Silas had found it while unloading the wagon and wordlessly placed it before Clara. They hadn't opened it yet. The note Arthur knew too much still burned in Clara's pocket. Croft isn't a man who likes being cornered by anyone, let alone a woman, Silas said, finally looking at her. The lamplight cast long, harsh shadows across his scarred cheek. You embarrassed him today. You threatened his empire with a statute book. Men like that don't fight fair, Clara. I don't expect him to, she replied, lifting her chin. But he operates through paper. If we unravel the paper, we unravel him. Paper won't stop lead, Silas murmured darkly. He stood up, walking toward the window to peer out into the driving rain. A jagged fork of lightning illuminated the yard in a flash of blinding magnesium white. In that fraction of a second, Silas saw it. A shadow that didn't belong to the barn. A silhouette standing near the corral fence, holding something long and metallic. Silas didn't shout. He didn't have time. Instinct, honed by years of hunting armed men in the dark, took over. Down! He roared, lunging away from the window. The glass shattered inward with a deafening crack, followed instantly by the explosive roar of a rifle shot. Clara barely registered the command before a wall of solid muscle hit her. Silas tackled her out of the wooden chair, his massive weight taking them both hard to the rough-hewn floorboards. The kerosene lantern took a hit, shattering and plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, save for the dying embers in the stove. Another shot rang out, chewing through the wood of the table exactly where Clara's chest had been a second before. Splinters rained down on them. Silas had her pinned beneath him, his heavy canvas duster acting as a shield over her body. The air was suddenly choked with the acrid, sulphurous stench of black powder and the metallic tang of fear. Clara couldn't breathe. Silas's chest was pressed flush against hers, his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against her ribs. One of his large hands was cradling the back of her head, pressing her face into the crook of his neck to protect her from flying debris. Stay down. Do not move, he breathed into her ear, his voice a lethal, vibrating rasp. For the first time since she had arrived in the West, Clara was truly, viscerally terrified. The abstract numbers in her ledgers had manifested into physical violence. But beneath the terror, another sensation bloomed with shocking clarity. The heat of Silas's body, the hard, immovable strength of him, the scent of pine, rain, and the faint, musky scent of a man operating on pure adrenaline. In the terrifying dark, surrounded by shattered glass and gunfire, she had never felt so violently safe. Silas rolled off her, moving with a terrifying silent grace that belied his massive size. He crawled through the glass, grabbing his Winchester from the floor. He didn't go to the window. He moved to the heavy oak door, pressing his back against the wall beside it, listening. The storm raged on. Rain blew in through the shattered windows, soaking the ledgers on the table. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The silence stretching between the thunderclaps was agonizing. He's gone, Silas finally whispered, his voice cutting through the dark. It was a warning shot, a drive-by to scare us. If he wanted us dead, he would have brought a posse and burned the cabin. Clara pushed herself up into a sitting position, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip her skirts to hide it. A warning for what? To back off, Silas said. He struck a match on the wall, the sudden flare illuminating the grim, murderous set of his jaw. He lit a spare candle. Croft is showing you what happens when you ask for public records. He turned to look at her. Clara was sitting amid a sea of broken glass, her pristine white blouse dusted with wood splinters, her hair half fallen from its neat braid. She was trembling, but her jaw was set in that same stubborn line that had made him step up to Croft at the train station. Silas crossed the room, dropping to one knee before her. He reached out, his large hands incredibly gentle as he brushed a shard of glass from her shoulder. "Are you hit?" he asked, his eyes frantically scanning her for blood. "No," she managed to say, her voice tight. "I'm fine. You saved my life." "I brought you into this," he corrected bitterly, his thumb grazing her collarbone as he checked for injuries. The touch sent a jolt straight to her core. "I should have never let you walk into that land office." "I am not a child, Silas," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. She reached up, her small hand wrapping around his thick wrist to stop his frantic searching. "I knew the risks. My ex-husband used lawyers to destroy me. Croft uses bullets. They are just different tools for the same cowardice. I am not running." Silas stared into her eyes, illuminated by the flickering candle. The air between them, already thick with gunpowder, suddenly thickened with something entirely different. The adrenaline of the attack was morphing into a raw, undeniable pull. His gaze dropped to her lips, parted and breathing heavy, before he forced himself to look away, pulling his hand from her grasp and standing up. "I'll board up the window," he said gruffly, turning his back to her. "You stay away from the glass." Neither of them slept the rest of the night. Silas sat in the corner with his rifle across his knees. Clara sat on the floor by the stove, wrapped in a blanket, watching him guard her. When the gray, washed-out light of morning finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, muddy world. Silas went outside to track the shooter's horse, leaving Clara alone in the wreckage of the cabin. She stood up, her joints aching, and began to sweep the broken glass. The wooden table was scarred by a deep bullet gouge. The ledgers were damp from the rain, but salvageable. Then her eyes fell on the burlap bundle Martha had given them. It had been knocked to the floor during the tackle. Clara set the broom down. She knelt, her fingers working the stiff knots of the twine. The burlap fell away, revealing a small, worn leather satchel. It was Arthur's. Inside was a shaving kit, a silver pocket watch, 2 letters Clara had written him from Cincinnati, and a small black pocket diary. Clara picked up the diary. It was thick, bound in cheap leather. But as she turned it in her hands, she frowned. The spine of the book was unnaturally rigid, and the leather on the back cover was torn, the pages within shredded and fused together in a thick, dark clump. Her breath hitched. She knew what dried blood looked like. With trembling fingers, she opened the diary to the ruined section. Buried deep within the pages, warping the paper and wedged against the binding, was a misshapen lump of gray lead. It was a bullet. Arthur Pendleton hadn't died of a sudden fever. He had been shot in the back, the bullet tearing through his coat and lodging in the diary he kept in his breast pocket. Gideon Croft hadn't just forged documents. He had ordered a murder to cover it up. The heavy wooden door opened. Silas stepped in, his boots caked in mud. Ryder headed east back toward town, kept to the rocks to hide the tracks. Croft's men, no doubt. He stopped, seeing Clara kneeling on the floor, staring at the small black book in her hands. She was as pale as a ghost. "Clara? What is it?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She held the diary out to him, pointing to the mangled piece of lead buried in the blood-stained pages. "This is Arthur's," she whispered, the words echoing in the silent cabin. "Silas. Arthur found something in the numbers, something worth killing for. And now Croft knows we're looking for it, too." Silas crossed the room in 2 strides. He took the book, his thumb brushing over the deformed bullet. The cold, detached demeanor of the rancher vanished entirely. In its place stood the Pinkerton man, the relentless hunter who had finally found the scent of his prey. "Pack a saddlebag," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "We're not fighting a paper war anymore, Clara. We're hunting a murderer." They didn't take the wagon. Speed and stealth were their only advantages now. Silas saddled his massive black gelding Midnight and prepared a gentle, sure-footed roan mare for Clara. "Can you ride astride?" he asked, eyeing her heavy woolen skirts as they stood in the crisp, cold air of the barn. "I learned to ride in Cincinnati, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, though her stomach churned at the thought of a grueling trek through the mountains. Without waiting for his help, she grabbed the pommel, set her boot in the stirrup, and swung herself up, throwing her leg over the saddle. Her skirt bunched up, revealing her practical leather boots and a scandalous amount of stocking-clad calf, but she didn't care. Decorum had died the moment the window shattered last night. Silas looked away quickly, a muscle feathering in his jaw before swinging into his own saddle. "We're heading up into the Sangre de Cristo foothills. There's an old man up there, Hiram Cobb. He was the original county surveyor before Croft took office and fired him. If anyone knows the truth about the acreage and the property lines, it's Hiram. And if Croft killed Arthur over land, the motive is in those original surveys. They rode hard for 6 hours, leaving the flat, dusty plains of Red Creek behind and ascending into the rugged, pine-choked trails of the mountains. The air grew thinner and colder, biting at Clara's cheeks. Every shadow looked like a man with a rifle. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gun hammer pulling back. By late afternoon, the horses were lathered, and Clara felt as though her spine had been shattered. Her hands, unaccustomed to gripping heavy leather reins for hours, were raw and blistered. But she didn't utter a single word of complaint. She kept her eyes fixed on Silas's broad back, following the path he carved through the wilderness. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the canyons, Silas pulled Midnight to a halt in a small, sheltered clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines. "We camp here," he announced, dismounting. "It's too dark to navigate the scree field safely. Cobb's cabin is another 2 hours up." Clara tried to dismount, but her legs were completely numb. As she slid from the saddle, her knees buckled. Silas was there instantly. His strong arms caught her around the waist before she hit the dirt. He hauled her against his chest, supporting her full weight. "I've got you," he murmured, his breath warm against her cold cheek. "I'm sorry," Clara gasped, deeply mortified by her weakness. She pressed her hands against his chest to push away, but her raw palms flared with agonizing pain. She hissed, curling her fingers inward. Silas frowned. He didn't let her go. Instead, he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her the few feet to a fallen log near the center of the clearing, and set her down gently. "Don't move," he commanded. He moved with swift efficiency, unsaddling the horses, hobbling them, and building a small, smokeless fire within a ring of stones. Clara watched him, mesmerized by the capable, fluid grace of a man perfectly in his element. The wilderness didn't frighten Silas. It welcomed him. Once the fire was crackling, casting a warm golden glow into the creeping darkness, Silas walked over to her. He pulled a canteen and a clean white cotton handkerchief from his saddlebag. He knelt in the dirt in front of her. "Give me your hands," he said softly. Clara hesitated, then slowly uncurled her fists, holding her hands out to him. The palms were bright red, several angry blisters torn open and weeping. Silas swore softly under his breath. He took her small hands in his massive ones. The contrast was startling. His skin scarred, tanned, and rough as sandstone, holding hers as delicately as if they were made of spun glass. He uncorked the canteen and poured the cold water over her palms, washing away the dirt and dried blood. Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out at the sting. "I know it hurts," Silas murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble that vibrated through the quiet clearing. "You should have told me to slow down." "I am not a burden to be accommodated, Silas," Clara said, looking down at his bowed head. The firelight caught the dark waves of his hair. "Arthur was murdered. You were almost shot. A few blisters do not matter." Silas stopped washing her hands. He looked up, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze stripped away the cold air, leaving Clara breathless. "They matter to me," he said simply. He took a small tin of salve from his pocket, a mixture of beeswax and pine resin, and began to work it gently into her broken skin. His thumbs massaged her palms in slow, hypnotic circles. The touch was functional, medical, yet the intimacy of it was overwhelming. Out here, miles away from civilization, the false pretense of their marriage felt utterly irrelevant. They were just a man and a woman, bound together by survival and a rapidly growing, undeniable gravity. "My ex-husband," Clara began, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the heavy silence. "He used to look at my hands and tell me I was too rigid, too obsessed with numbers and ledgers to be a proper, soft wife. When he ran, leaving me to face his creditors, I believed him. I thought my desire for order was what drove him away. Silas's hands went perfectly still. His jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek standing out in stark relief. "Your ex-husband was a fool," Silas said, his voice laced with quiet venom. "And a coward. A man who runs from a strong woman doesn't deserve her." He looked down at her ink-stained, blistered hands, then brought them up, pressing his lips gently against the raw knuckles. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The touch of his lips was brief, but it scorched her to her core. "Your hands are capable, Clara," Silas said, looking deeply into her eyes. "They read the truth when I was too blind to see it. They held a dying man's diary without flinching. There ain't nothing wrong with being strong." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from the pain of her blisters, but from the profound relief of finally being seen and valued for exactly who she was. She looked at the jagged scar on his face. Without thinking, she reached out with her bandaged hand, her fingertips hovering just inches from the ruined skin of his cheek. "And what about your scars, Silas?" she asked softly. "Do you believe they make you a monster?" "Because I don't." Silas closed his eyes, leaning imperceptibly into the warmth of her hovering hand. The tension between them was a physical thing, a taut wire ready to snap. He wanted to pull her off that log, pull her into his lap, and kiss the defiance right out of her mouth. He wanted to make her forget every man who had ever made her feel less than extraordinary. But he was a man who brought death in his wake, and she was a woman trying to build a life. He opened his eyes, the cold control slamming back into place. He pulled back, dropping her hands. "Get some sleep, Clara. We ride at first light." He stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight, putting his back to her, standing guard in the dark. Clara pulled her blanket tight around her shoulders, her hands throbbing, her heart aching with a confusing, wonderful kind of pain. They reached Hiram Cobb's cabin by mid-morning. It was a shack built into the side of a rocky outcrop, nearly invisible until they were right on top of it. Silas didn't dismount immediately. He called out, "Hiram, it's Silas Thorne. I brought coffee and questions." A long moment passed before the heavy wooden door creaked open. An old man, thin as a rail and sporting a wild white beard, stepped out, a double-barreled shotgun leveled directly at Silas's chest. "You're a long way from the dirt plains, Thorne," Hiram rasped. He narrowed his roomy eyes, taking in Clara. "And you brought a woman. You gone soft?" "I brought my wife," Silas corrected, dismounting slowly, keeping his hands visible. "And I brought trouble, Hiram. Gideon Croft." At the mention of the mayor's name, Hiram spat into the dirt. He lowered the shotgun. "That snake, come inside." "Come, but keep the door bolted." Inside, the cabin smelled of cured meat and old paper. The walls were lined with hundreds of tightly rolled canvas maps stuffed into cubbyholes. It was the archive of a man who knew every inch of the county. Clara wasted no time. She pulled Arthur's blood-stained diary from her satchel and laid it on Hiram's small table. She explained the tax discrepancies, the altered boundary lines, and the bullet they had found. Hiram listened in silence, his gnarled hands gripping the edge of the table. When she finished, he let out a bitter, hacking laugh. "Taxes," Hiram scoffed. "You think Gideon Croft is risking a hanging just to skim a few $100 in back taxes from you dirt farmers?" He turned and walked to a specific cubbyhole, pulling out a thick, dust-covered canvas tube. He brought it to the table, unrolling it and weighing the corners down with a coffee mug and an iron skillet. "This is the master topographical survey of the Red Creek Valley," Hiram said, tapping a long, bony finger on a specific quadrant. "The one I drew 5 years ago. The one Croft fired me over because he wanted to draw his own." Clara and Silas leaned over the map. Silas pointed to 2 adjacent squares of land. "That's my spread, the Broken Spur. And that's Arthur Pendleton's land to the east." "Now," Hiram said, his eyes glittering with manic vindication, He pulled a second smaller piece of translucent vellum from his pocket and laid it over the map. Red lines were drawn across the vellum, cutting a harsh, straight path through the topography. 3 months ago, a surveyor from Chicago came through, drinking heavily at the saloon, Hiram said softly. I paid the barkeep to let me take a look at the man's saddlebags while he was passed out. I traced this. Clara stared at the red line on the vellum. It snaked down from the northern mountains, cut directly through the center of Arthur Pendleton's property, and slashed straight across the Broken Spur's eastern pasture, heading south toward the border. "What is that line?" Silas asked, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "That," Clara breathed, her mind connecting the dots with horrifying clarity, "is the proposed route for the new transcontinental railroad spur." "Bingo," Hiram said grimly. "The rail company needs a flat, direct route through the valley. They pay premium government rates for right-of-way buyouts, thousands of dollars per acre." Clara looked up at Silas, her eyes wide. The puzzle was complete. Croft isn't stealing your land for taxes. He's inflating your debt to force a foreclosure. And he killed Arthur because Arthur figured out the eastern boundary line was the key. Croft wants to own the land when the railroad agents arrive next month. He stands to make a fortune, completely legally on paper. Silas stared at this blood-stained map. Arthur's death, the bullet through the window, the fake ledger entries. It all led to this red line. "He's going to wipe us off the map," Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. He reached out and rolled the map up, gripping it like a weapon. He looked at Clara, the Pinkerton bounty hunter fully resurrected in his ice-blue eyes. "Not if we burn his map first," Clara said, her chin lifting, ready for war. The ride down from the Sangre de Cristo foothills was a grueling descent into the belly of the beast. They carried the canvas tube containing Hiram Cobb's master map, like a holy relic, knowing it was the only thing standing between Gideon Croft and total dominion over the valley. They reached the flatlands as twilight bled the color from the sky, replacing the brilliant desert golds with bruised, ominous purples. The Broken Spur lay ahead, steeped in an unnatural quiet. The wind had died entirely. Silas pulled Midnight to a halt a quarter-mile from the cabin, his hand instinctively dropping to the stock of his Winchester. His eyes scanned the horizon, reading the shadows. "Stay here," he ordered Clara in a low whisper, his gaze fixed on the dark silhouette of the barn. "I am not waiting in the dark," Clara retorted, her grip tightening on the reins of her roan mare. Her blistered hands throbbed beneath her leather riding gloves, but the pain was a distant hum compared to the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "If they are here for both of us." Silas looked back at her. The moonlight caught the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He let out a breath that was half frustration, half profound admiration. "Keep your mare behind Midnight. If shooting starts, you ride for the ridge. You don't look back. Do you understand me, Clara?" "I understand," she said, though she made no promise to obey. They approached the cabin at a slow walk. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dry dust and something else. Silas flared his nostrils, pulling up short. "Kerosene." Before the word fully left his mouth, a brilliant, terrifying whoosh shattered the night. A wall of orange flame erupted from the eastern wall of the barn, instantly climbing the dry, weathered timber. In seconds, the fire licked at the hayloft. The sudden, violent illumination threw dancing, demonic shadows across the yard. And then came the sound that chilled Silas to his very marrow, the high-pitched, panicked screams of the draft horses trapped inside. "No!" Silas roared. He spurred Midnight forward, leaping from the saddle before the gelding even came to a full stop. He drew his Colt, scanning the perimeter, but the arsonists were hidden in the dark beyond the firelight. Clara dismounted, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heat from the burning barn was already a physical weight against her face. "Silas, wait!" she screamed over the roar of the flames. But he wasn't listening. He couldn't. The horses were his livelihood, his responsibility. He bolted toward the heavy barn doors, holstering his gun to throw his massive shoulder against the burning wood. The doors groaned and gave way, unleashing a backdraft of thick, choking black smoke. Silas disappeared into the inferno. Clara ran forward, coughing, her eyes streaming. The roar of the fire was deafening, a living, breathing monster consuming everything in its path. "Silas!" Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the side of the cabin. A man stepped into the flickering light, a rifle raised to his shoulder. He was aiming directly at the open barn doors, waiting for Silas to emerge from the smoke. It was one of Croft's hired thugs from town, his face twisted in a cruel, anticipating grin. Clara didn't think. The meticulous, orderly world of ledgers and ink vanished, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct to protect the man she loved. She plunged her hand into her heavy skirt pocket and pulled out the small, double-barreled Derringer she had packed in Cincinnati, a weapon meant for city alleys, not frontier warfare. Her hands shook violently, the blisters screaming in protest, but she gripped the cold steel with both hands, raised it, and aimed at the center of the man's mass. "Hey!" she screamed. The thug jumped, startled by the woman's voice. He pivoted, bringing the rifle around to face her. Clara pulled the trigger. The recoil snapped her wrists back, the sharp crack of the small pistol momentarily cutting through the roar of the fire. The thug grunted, stumbling backward as the .41 caliber bullet caught him high in the shoulder. His rifle discharged into the dirt and he dropped it, clutching his collarbone with a string of vicious curses before turning and fleeing into the darkness. A second later, Silas burst from the burning barn. He was a terrifying sight. His canvas duster was smoking, his face blackened with soot. In his hands, he held the lead ropes of the 3 panicked draft horses, using his sheer brute strength to drag the massive, terrified animals out of the fire. He hauled them into the corral, slamming the gate shut. Then he collapsed to his knees in the dirt, coughing violently, gasping for the clean night air. Clara dropped the Derringer and ran to him, falling to her knees in the mud beside him. "Silas! Silas! Look at me!" He looked up, his chest heaving. The left sleeve of his shirt was scorched away, revealing angry, blistering red flesh along his forearm. But his ice-blue eyes were wide, fixed on the small pistol lying in the dirt behind her, and then on the trail of blood leading away into the dark. "You shot him," Silas rasped, his voice shredded by the smoke. "He was going to shoot you in the back," Clara said, her voice breaking. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "I couldn't let him." Silas stared at her. This refined, educated woman from the East, in her ruined skirts and soot-stained blouse, had just drawn blood to save his life. The realization hit him with the force of a runaway train. He reached out with his unburned arm, wrapping his hand behind her neck, and pulled her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of smoke and the sweet underlying scent that was purely her. "We need to get inside," Silas said roughly, pulling back. "They might circle back." They abandoned the barn to the flames. There was nothing more to be done for it. It would burn to the foundation. They grabbed the saddlebags containing the map and the diary, and Silas kicked the cabin door open, securing the heavy iron bolt behind them. The cabin was dark and freezing. Clara fumbled with a match, lighting the single kerosene lantern. When the yellow light flared, she finally got a good look at Silas's arm. The burn was brutal. The skin from his elbow to his wrist was raw, red, and beginning to blister. "Sit down," Clara ordered. The tremble in her voice was gone, replaced by the steel rod of necessity. She was back in her element, bringing order to chaos. She moved to the wash basin, pouring clean water into a bowl, then grabbed a clean linen towel and the tin of pine resin salve he had used on her hands just a day ago. Silas sat heavily in the chair at the table, watching her. The pain in his arm was a blinding sheet of fire, but it was secondary to the storm raging in his chest. He watched Clara's face as she knelt beside his chair. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, looking up at him. Her gray eyes were wide, swimming with unshed tears. "I've had worse," Silas lied. Clara began to clean the soot and ruined fabric from his burn. Her touch was excruciatingly light, trembling with an empathy that tore at his defenses. Every time he flinched, a small, pained breath escaped her lips, as if she were feeling the fire herself. "You shouldn't have gone in there," Clara said, her voice thick as she applied the thick, cooling salve to his angry flesh. "You could have died for those horses." "They're my responsibility," Silas said gruffly, his jaw clenched tight. "I don't let the things in my care burn, Clara." Clara stopped wrapping the clean linen bandage around his arm. She looked up, her face inches from his. The air in the cabin shifted, thickening until it was hard to breathe. The smell of smoke faded, replaced by the overwhelming magnetic pull that had been building between them since the moment he claimed her on the train platform. "And am I your responsibility, Silas?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Silas looked at her lips, parted and trembling. He looked at the soot smudged across her cheek, the fierce, beautiful intelligence in her eyes. He thought about the sound of her small pistol firing in the dark, defending him. The last of his walls, built over 5 years of guilt and isolation, crumbled into dust. "No," Silas rumbled, his voice dropping to a ragged, desperate pitch. "You are my absolute ruin." He reached out with his uninjured hand, threading his thick fingers through the hair at the nape of her neck. He didn't pull her to him. He simply waited, giving her the choice. Clara didn't hesitate. She surged upward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her mouth fiercely against his. The kiss was an explosion. It tasted of smoke, salt, and raw, unadulterated need. Silas groaned, a deep, primal sound in the back of his throat, and his arm came around her waist, hauling her up from her knees and into his lap. Clara went willingly, straddling his thighs, her hands tangling in his thick, dark hair. There was nothing gentle about it. It was a collision of two people who had danced on the edge of death and desperately needed to affirm that they were alive. Silas's mouth was demanding, parting her lips, tasting her with a hunger that bordered on starvation. Clara met his passion with an intensity that shocked them both, her blistered hands gripping his shoulders, anchoring herself to his solid strength. He tore his mouth away, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down her jaw, to the pulse beating frantically at her throat. Clara gasped, her head falling back, exposing the long column of her neck to him. "Clara," he breathed against her skin, the word a prayer and a surrender. "Are you sure? Once I take you, I am never letting you go." Clara opened her eyes, looking down at the scarred, dangerous, incredibly honorable man, holding her. The contract they had signed in the town post office was a piece of paper. This, the heat, the trust, the overwhelming surge of love, was the reality. "I don't want to go anywhere," she whispered fiercely. She reached down, her fingers deftly working the buttons of his shirt, pushing the fabric aside to press her bare palm flat against the heavy, thudding heat of his chest. "Make me your wife, Silas. Truly." He didn't need to be told twice. He stood up, carrying her in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all, mindful of his burned arm. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides and laid her gently on the narrow bed in the corner. The storm of their adrenaline slowed, transitioning into something deeper, heavier, and infinitely more profound. In the flickering golden light of the kerosene lantern, they stripped away the soot-stained clothes and the lingering ghosts of their pasts. Silas was a revelation of scarred muscle and terrifying strength, but his touch was a masterclass in reverence. He mapped the curves of her body with his calloused hands, treating her with a worshipful awe that made Clara weep silent tears of joy. Her ex-husband had made her feel inadequate, a ledger to be balanced. Silas made her feel like the only woman on earth. When they finally came together, it was with a searing, breath-stealing intensity. Clara cried out, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back, anchoring him as the wave crashed over them. They moved together in the shadowed cabin, matching each other's desperate rhythm, burning away the horrors of the night, and forging a bond that no corrupt mayor, no bullet, and no fire could ever sever. Hours later, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the cooling stove. Silas lay on his back, Clara tucked perfectly against his side, her head resting on his chest, her arm draped across his stomach. The smell of the burning barn had seeped through the cracks, a bitter reminder of the reality waiting outside. Silas stared up at the dark ceiling, his hand gently stroking Clara's bare shoulder. He had a wife, a real, brilliant, fiercely brave wife, and tomorrow he was going to have to kill a man to keep her. The morning sun rose, cruel and bright, illuminating the devastation. Where the sturdy pine barn had stood, only a smoldering, blackened skeleton remained. A thick column of gray smoke drifted lazily into the crisp blue New Mexico sky, a signal fire to Gideon Croft that his warning had been delivered. Inside the cabin, Clara stood at the wooden table, fully dressed in her practical gray skirt and a fresh blouse, her hair tightly braided. She looked at the blood-stained map and the diary, then out the window at the ruins. The intimacy and vulnerability of the night before hadn't softened her. It had tempered her into steel. She had something precious to lose now, and she refused to lose it. Silas walked in, the heavy door shutting behind him. He had tied a clean bandana around his burned arm, but he moved with a stiff, guarded caution. His Winchester was gripped tightly in his right hand. "I rode up to the North Ridge," Silas said, his voice grim. He walked to the table, setting the rifle down. "We're boxed in. Croft has men posted on the main road into Red Creek and 2 riders patrolling the southern trail toward the train depot. The telegraph office in town is guarded. We can't mail the evidence, and we can't wire the territorial marshal without going through Croft's thugs." Clara traced the red line of the proposed railroad on Hiram's map. "He knows what we have, or at least he suspects it. He is trying to starve us out or force us to make a desperate run so his men can shoot us in the open and claim we were fleeing outlaws." "He owns the sheriff," Silas added, pouring himself a cup of cold coffee. "If we ride into town, the sheriff will arrest us on trumped-up charges, confiscate the evidence, and we'll both hang in a cell before the week is out." Clara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as her mind, honed by years of balancing impossible ledgers, began to calculate the odds. "Then we don't sneak into town, and we don't try to run past them." Silas looked at her. "Clara, there are at least 6 armed men between here and that land office." "I know," Clara said. She picked up the small derringer from the table. "They are expecting us to run, Silas. They are expecting a terrified woman and a desperate rancher to try and slip through the net. When people expect you to hide, the most dangerous thing you can do is stand in the light." She turned to him, her eyes burning with a brilliant tactical fire. "I will take the wagon, I will load my trunk into it, and I will drive it fast and hard down the southern trail toward the depot. I will look exactly like a terrified Eastern bride who realized the frontier is too violent and is running for the first train home." Silas's blood ran cold. "Absolutely not." "Listen to me," Clara insisted, stepping toward him. "They will see me. They will assume I am carrying the map and the diary to get them out of the county. They will pull off the main road to intercept me." "And then what, Clara?" Silas roared, the sudden volume making the coffee cups rattle on the table. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into her arms. "They catch you? They drag you off that wagon and put a bullet in you like they did Arthur? I am not using my wife as bait." "They won't shoot me immediately," Clara argued, her voice rising to match his, refusing to back down. "Croft needs the documents. They will stop the wagon to search it. It will buy you an hour. 1 hour, Silas, with the main road clear for you to ride midnight straight into Red Creek." "To do what? Hand myself over to the sheriff?" "To ride straight to the mercantile," Clara corrected, her tone sharp and precise. "Martha Higgins hates Croft. Her husband was killed by men like him. You give the map and the diary to Martha. She hides them in her floorboards, and she wires the territorial marshal in Santa Fe using the telegraph key she keeps hidden in her back room." Silas stared at her. "Martha has a telegraph key?" "I saw the copper wire running from the main pole behind her store when we were loading supplies," Clara said. "She taps the line. She knows everything that goes in and out of Red Creek. You get the evidence to her, and then you come find me." Silas released her shoulders, stepping back, running a hand over his face. The plan was brilliant. It was logical. It used Croft's arrogance and sexism against him. Croft's men would never believe the woman was a decoy, and Silas hated it with every fiber of his being. "I lost one person because I trusted the paper, Clara," Silas said, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper. The memory of the hanging man in Denver flashed in his eyes. "I will not lose the woman I love because I sent her out alone to face a firing squad." The words "the woman I love" hung in the air between them, spoken aloud for the very first time. Clara's breath hitched. She took a step forward, closing the distance, and pressed her hand against his cheek, her thumb brushing the jagged scar. "You won't lose me," she whispered fiercely. "Because we are not victims anymore, Silas. I am not the woman who let her husband bankrupt her, and you are not the Pinkerton who shot the wrong man. We are the Thorns, and we are going to burn Gideon Croft's empire to the ground." Silas looked into her gray eyes. There was no fear there, only a terrifying, beautiful resolve. He realized then that he couldn't stop her. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was outlining their strategy. He covered her hand with his own, pressing a hard kiss to her palm. "If they touch a single hair on your head, Clara, I won't just kill Croft. I'll burn the whole damn town." "I know," she smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "Now, help me pack my trunk. We have a train to catch." An hour later, the trap was set. Clara sat on the bench of the wagon, holding the heavy leather reins. She had unbound her hair, letting it fall in a chaotic tangle around her shoulders, and smeared a streak of soot across her cheek. She looked exactly the part of a panicked, broken woman fleeing for her life. Behind her, her heavy trunk was strapped down, visibly bulging. Silas stood beside the wagon, holding Midnight's reins. He wore his long canvas duster, the Winchester fully loaded in the scabbard, his Colt riding low and heavy on his thigh. His face was a mask of cold, lethal intent. He handed Clara a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle. It looked exactly like the rolled-up map and diary. "It's just rolled-up ledger paper and a block of wood," Silas said, his voice tight. "But it will take them a few minutes to untie the knots. When they realize it's a fake, you don't fight them, Clara. You tell them I have the real ones, and you tell them exactly where I am." "I will," Clara said. She tucked the small derringer beneath the blanket on the seat next to her, just in case. Silas reached up, gripping the back of her neck, and pulled her down for a searing, desperate kiss. It tasted of fear, promise, and gunpowder. "1 hour," Silas swore against her lips. "I'll be there." "Ride fast, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, pulling back, her eyes shining. She snapped the reins. "Ha!" The draft horses surged forward. The wagon rattled violently out of the yard, kicking up a plume of dry dust as Clara steered them toward the southern trail away from the town. Silas watched her go, his heart pounding a sickening rhythm against his ribs. He waited until the wagon disappeared behind the first rise, counting the seconds. He imagined Croft's men on the ridge, seeing the dust, signaling each other, leaving their post to chase the vulnerable woman with the prize. Silas reached into his saddlebag, checking the heavy oilcloth bundle that held the real map and Arthur's blood-stained diary. It was secure. He swung up into Midnight's saddle. The massive black gelding danced in place, feeling the violent tension radiating from his rider. Silas pulled his Stetson low over his eyes. He didn't look back at the smoldering ruins of his barn. He looked north, toward Red Creek, toward Gideon Croft. With a sharp kick of his spurs, Silas sent the horse launching forward into a dead sprint. The final hand was dealt. It was time to see who was bluffing. The midday sun beat down on the main street of Red Creek like a blacksmith's hammer. The air was dead and heavy, shimmering with heat distortion above the rutted dirt. Every door was shut. Every window blind was pulled tight. The town was holding its breath. Silas Thorne rode Midnight hard into town, pulling the lathered gelding to a sharp halt in the alley behind the General Mercantile. He dismounted smoothly, his spurs jingling, a sharp metallic sound that cut through the unnatural silence. He grabbed the heavy oilcloth bundle from his saddlebag and strode to the back door, pounding his fist against the wood in a rapid staccato rhythm. The door unbolted instantly. Martha Higgins stood there, a double-barreled shotgun resting easily in the crook of her arm. "They took the bait," Silas said, stepping inside. He thrust the bundle into her hands. Hiram Cobb's master survey and Arthur Pendleton's diary. "The bullet is still wedged in the binding." Martha's iron-gray eyes widened slightly, then hardened into flint. She took the bundle, weighing the lives it represented. Gideon Croft's death warrant. "Only if the territorial marshal reads it," Silas said grimly, checking the cylinder of his Colt. "Are you wired directly to Santa Fe?" "I am," Martha said, turning toward the small, cramped storage room where a copper telegraph key sat hidden beneath a crate of dried apples. "I'll start tapping." But Silas, Croft's foreman, a vicious dog named Vance, didn't ride out after the wagon. He stayed in town. Silas's blood turned to ice. Before he could ask what that meant, the sound of a woman's sharp cry echoed from the street out front. It was Clara. Silas didn't think. The Pinkerton bounty hunter, the man who had buried his lethal instincts beneath years of quiet ranching, erupted to the surface. He kicked the front door of the mercantile open, stepping out onto the wooden boardwalk into the blinding glare of high noon. 50 yards away, standing in the center of the dusty street in front of the brick land office, was Gideon Croft, and next to him, struggling fiercely against the iron grip of a massive scarred thug, was Clara. Her hair was a wild, dark tangle down her back, her gray skirt torn at the hem. A fresh bruise was blooming on her cheekbone, but her gray eyes were blazing with an absolute, unholy fury. She hadn't broken. She had been intercepted on the southern trail just as planned, but the men had realized the decoy too quickly and dragged her back to their boss. "Thorne!" Croft shouted, his voice echoing off the false-fronted buildings. He was sweating, his pristine waistcoat unbuttoned, the oily veneer of the polite mayor completely stripped away. He held a silver-plated revolver, its barrel leveled carelessly at Clara's stomach. "I knew a dirt farmer wouldn't be smart enough to orchestrate a decoy. She brought the fake, which means you have the real map." Silas stepped off the boardwalk. His canvas duster swept back, clearing the holster on his thigh. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the center of the street. "Let my wife go, Croft," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the terrifying, vibrating promise of a landslide. "This is between you and me. Bring me the surveyor's map and Pendleton's diary, and I'll consider letting her live," Croft yelled, his panic beginning to show. He knew time was running out. He knew the town was watching from the cracks in their shutters. Clara locked eyes with Silas across the dusty expanse. She saw the lethal stillness in his frame, the cold calculation in his ice-blue eyes. She gave him a microscopic shake of her head. "Do not give it to him." "I don't have them," Silas lied smoothly, taking another slow step forward. "I hid them where you'll never find them. Shoot her, and you hang for murder with nothing to show for it." "He's lying," the thug holding Clara barked. "Check the mercantile." "Shoot him!" Croft screamed, losing his nerve entirely. He raised his silver revolver toward Silas. But Clara was a woman who understood the precise value of a distraction. In the fraction of a second before Croft could pull the trigger, Clara stomped her heavy leather riding boot down onto the thug's instep with bone-crushing force. As the man bellowed in pain and his grip loosened, she twisted violently, reaching into the folds of her ruined skirt. She hadn't lost her derringer. She pulled the small pistol, jamming the barrel directly into the thigh of the man holding her, and pulled the trigger. The thug screamed, his leg buckling, releasing her entirely. Clara threw herself to the dirt, rolling away. Bang! Croft fired, but his aim was wild, the bullet tearing a hole through the edge of Silas's duster. Silas's draw was a blur of motion, a terrifying testament to a past he had tried to bury. The Colt 45 cleared leather and fired in a single, fluid heartbeat. The bullet struck Croft's silver revolver, shattering the cylinder and tearing 3 of the mayor's fingers off in a spray of crimson. Croft shrieked, dropping the ruined gun, falling to his knees in the dust. Another thug stepped out from the alley beside the saloon, leveling a Winchester at Silas's back. Boom! A deafening roar came from the mercantile. Martha Higgins stood on her porch, her double-barreled shotgun smoking, the thug in the alley thrown backward into the horse trough by the buckshot. "The marshal in Santa Fe just confirmed my wire," Martha hollered into the street, her voice ringing like a church bell. "He's boarding a special train right now." "It's over, Croft." Gideon Croft, bleeding, ruined, and facing the hangman's noose, looked wildly around the street. His empire was collapsing. With a desperate, animalistic howl, he scrambled to his feet and ran up the steps, throwing himself through the doors of the land office. "He's going to burn the records," Clara screamed, scrambling up from the dirt. "If he destroys the county ledgers, we can't prove the fraud to the marshal." Silas didn't care about the ledgers. He only cared that the man who had murdered Arthur and put a gun to his wife's head was still breathing. He holstered his Colt, drew his long hunting knife from his boot, and sprinted up the stairs, kicking the land office doors wide open. Inside, Croft had already smashed a kerosene lamp over the massive stacks of property deeds and tax rolls. The dry, aged paper went up like kindling. A wall of fire instantly separated the front counter from the back archive room. "You're a dead man, Thorne," Croft screamed from behind the flames, coughing wildly. Silas lunged through the wall of fire, tackling Croft to the floorboards. The 2 men rolled violently into the archive room. Croft fought with the frantic strength of a trapped rat, gouging at Silas's eyes, striking his freshly burned arm. Silas grunted in pain, but his grip was iron. He pinned Croft to the floor, raising his fist to end it. Suddenly the ceiling groaned. The fire had reached the dry roof timbers and they were giving way. "Silas!" Clara had run into the burning building. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. She saw Silas pinning Croft, but she also saw the massive flaming oak support beam cracking directly above them. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the burning ledgers that held the key to the county's wealth. She threw herself into the archive room, grabbing Silas by the collar of his heavy duster. "Move!" she screamed, hauling backward with every ounce of strength she possessed. Silas let go of Croft, throwing his weight backward just as Clara pulled him. The flaming oak beam crashed down with a deafening roar, completely crushing the space where Silas had been a fraction of a second before, burying Gideon Croft beneath 1,000 pounds of burning timber and the very forged documents he had killed to protect. The shockwave knocked Clara and Silas to the floor. The building was collapsing around them. Silas wrapped his arms around Clara, shielding her with his body, and drove them both forward, bursting through the shattered front window of the land office just as the roof caved in behind them. They hit the dusty street hard, rolling away from the intense heat of the inferno. For a long moment, the only sound was the roar of the fire consuming the land office, and the ragged, desperate panting of their own breath. Silas pushed himself up on one elbow. He looked down at Clara. She was covered in soot, her dress ruined, her hands bleeding. But she was looking up at him with a fierce, brilliant light in her gray eyes. "You threw away the evidence," Silas rasped, his voice thick with smoke and awe. "You ran into a burning building for me, and you didn't grab a single ledger." Clara reached up, her soot-stained fingers tracing the line of his jaw, resting gently over his scar. "Paper doesn't keep you warm at night, Silas," she whispered, a tear finally cutting a clean track down her dirty cheek. "And paper doesn't love you back. I made my choice." Silas closed his eyes, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. Right there, in the middle of the dusty street, with the town of Red Creek finally stepping out from their homes to watch the tyrant's empire burn to ash, Silas Thorne knew he was the richest man in the territory. The autumn wind sweeping off the Sangre de Cristo mountains carried the crisp, clean scent of pine and the promise of a mild winter. At the broken spur, the devastating scars of the previous year had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of life. Where the blackened ruins of the old barn had stood, A magnificent new structure of golden, freshly milled timber rose against the sky. Inside, the stalls were full of healthy draft horses, their coats gleaming in the afternoon light. Clara Thorne sat at the long wooden table inside the cabin. The front door was wide open, letting in the golden sunlight and the cool breeze. The cabin itself had changed. There were curtains on the windows now, a colorful braided rug on the floorboards, and the smell of roasting chicken and fresh rosemary filled the air. It was no longer a fortress. It was a home. Clara dipped her pen into the inkwell, her eyes scanning the neat, precise columns of the ledger before her. She smiled. The numbers were beautiful. They told a story of a bumper crop of winter wheat, the successful sale of 3 foals, and a ledger completely free of debt. The territorial marshal's arrival in Red Creek a year ago had been swift and merciless. Hiram Cobb's map and Arthur Pendleton's diary had been more than enough to expose the massive railroad conspiracy. The corrupt sheriff had been arrested, the stolen lands were returned to the rightful owners or their next of kin, and the railroad company was forced to negotiate fair, transparent market prices for their right-of-way. Red Creek had breathed a collective sigh of relief, and Clara had spent 3 months untangling the financial mess Croft had left behind, becoming the unofficial and highly respected bookkeeper for half the ranches in the valley. Heavy, familiar footsteps sounded on the porch. Clara didn't look up from her numbers, but the smile on her face widened. "If you track mud onto my clean rug, Silas Thorne, I will make you sleep on the porch again." "I wiped my boots, woman," came the deep, gravelly rumble. Silas stepped into the cabin. He took off his Stetson, hanging it on the peg by the door. The year had been good to him. The haunted, isolated look in his ice-blue eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, quiet contentment. The scar on his cheek was still there, a permanent reminder of his past, but the rigid tension in his shoulders had melted away. He walked up behind her chair, resting his large, calloused hands on her shoulders. He leaned down, pressing a lingering, warm kiss to the sensitive skin just beneath her ear. Clara shivered, her pen pausing on the page. Even after a year of marriage, the touch of his hands sent a thrill of electricity straight to her core. "How do the books look, Mrs. Thorne?" Silas murmured, his breath tickling her neck. "They look highly profitable, Mr. Thorne," Clara replied, leaning her head back against his solid chest. She reached up, covering his rough hand with her own. Her blisters had long since healed, leaving smooth skin with only a faint tracing of scars. "The new barn is fully paid off, and we have enough surplus to buy the neighboring pasture from the bank if we want it." Silas hummed softly, turning his head to press his lips against her temple. "We don't need more land. We have everything we need right here." He gently took the pen from her fingers, setting it down on the table. Then he scooped his arms under her waist and lifted her effortlessly from the chair, spinning her around so she was pressed flush against him. Clara laughed, a bright, clear sound that Silas thought was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. She wrapped her arms around his neck, looking up into his eyes. "You are interrupting official ranch business," she teased, though she made no move to step out of his embrace. "The ranch can wait," Silas said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate pitch that always made her heart flutter. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the delicate features of her face. "Martha Higgins sent a package out with the stage driver today. Left it on the porch." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Did she finally find the specific blend of Earl Grey tea I asked for?" "No," Silas smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of thick parchment. "It's from the governor's office in Santa Fe. The official stamped deed to the broken spur, uncontested, unencumbered, and permanently recorded." Clara took the heavy parchment. She ran her fingers over the raised wax seal. After everything they had fought for, everything they had bled for, the paper war was finally, definitively over. No one could ever threaten their home again. She looked up at Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears of profound joy. "It's beautiful." "It's just paper," Silas said softly, his thumbs gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "You taught me that. You taught the paper isn't what matters." He placed his large, warm hand flat against her stomach. It was still flat, but the secret they had discovered just 2 weeks ago was blooming within her. A new life growing in the safety and love they had built together. "This," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion, looking from her stomach up to her eyes. "You, our family. This is what matters. This is the only truth I need." Clara dropped the deed onto the table, abandoning it next to the open ledger. She didn't care about the numbers anymore. She framed Silas's scarred face in her hands, pulling him down to meet her lips. The kiss was slow, deep, and overflowing with a love that had been forged in the fire and tempered in the quiet, steady days of peace. Outside, the New Mexico sun bathed the valley in a warm, golden light. The wind rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree, and a hawk circled lazily in the endless blue sky. Silas Thorne had ridden into town for a sack of grain. He had expected to return to a cold, empty cabin and a life of solitary penance. Instead, he had brought home a fierce, brilliant woman who had torn down his walls, fought his demons, and rewritten the entire story of his life. And as Silas held his wife in his arms, feeling the steady, strong beat of her heart against his own, he knew with absolute certainty that this was a happily ever after that no one could ever take away.